Claire Spencer is a middle-aged woman who is getting her daughter ready to drive to college. She wakes up, and her husband, Norman Spencer, cuddles up to her and is getting ready for work. Claire Spencer helps her daughter put some final things in her trunk and sees her off. Her daughter lets her mother know she is welcome to call her anytime, and makes sure she is okay. Claire laughs her daughter's concerns off, and tells her she is fine. Later, Claire and Norman go to visit Caitlin in her new dorm room at college, and say goodbye, and Claire breaks down crying as they leave, emotional that her daughter is all grown up and independent. When they get home, Claire gets cozy with Norman, and they begin to make out when they hear the next-door neighbors making love loudly. They go to look over, and they laugh at how they fight 1 minute and then have passionate lovemaking the next. They go back to bed and become intimate. The next morning after Norman leaves for work, Claire looks through a box of old memories. She becomes emotional at her old self with her first husband and looks over at the violin that she hasn't touched in many years. She cries and runs out to sit on her garden seat. Surprisingly, she hears her next-door neighbor crying too. She sounds very distressed, so Claire tries to talk to her through the fence. She cannot really understand her neighbor because she is crying so much, but she manages to hear her mention that her husband is too much and that she just can't, and she is so frightened she might one day disappear. Claire tries to ask for clarification and asks what she can do to help. Mrs. Fewer, her neighbor, stops crying for a second and frantically says that her husband is back and she must go, and to forget all that she said, and she runs back into her house. When Norman comes home, Claire tells him about how upset her neighbor was and how she suspects she is frightened of her husband and wants to do something. She would be worried if something happens to her, and she never did anything about it. Norman is not convinced there is any real harm going on and doesn't want to confront them at all, explaining that all couples argue and fight. Claire feels hurt that he is not taking her seriously and sulkily leaves the table. Norman appeases her in the kitchen, saying he can use a contact at work to check the background of the husband to see if he has any bad history. Claire brightens at this and thanks Norman. The next morning, Claire walks over with a nice welcome to the neighborhood basket of goodies for her neighbor and knocks on the door, but no one is around. She walks back to her house with her basket and sees her friend Jody has come to visit her. They hug, and Claire asks if she is staying, but she says no, she only came by to quickly check on how she is holding up. Claire becomes a little defensive that Jody is worried about her, just like her daughter Caitlin was. Jody brings up that she would be freaking out if her only daughter went to college, and then reminded Claire of the big move to the house and the car accident before that. Claire agrees and says the car crash was exactly a year ago. Jody pulls out a gift for her, Kambuka mushroom tea, for soothing heartbreak and enhancing psychic ability. The next night, it's raining, and as Claire is going to shut her window, she sees her neighbor put something large, the size and shape of a human, into his backseat. She excitedly tells Norman to wake up and have a look. She runs over to him to wake him up, but when she gets back to the window and Norman looks, there is no one there. Norman grumbles and goes back to bed. The next day, Claire tries to see her female neighbor and goes to her front door as well as look over the back fence, but sees no sign of her. She Rose Thorn in the process and runs back to her house to tend to her wound. As she walks up to open the door opens for her. She shuts it after her, and when she goes to the kitchen and comes back, it is open again. She thinks that there is something faulty with her doorknob mechanism. She walks down to the jetty while she is making a phone call to her daughter Caitlin, but she is not there. Cooper, her dog, is acting strange and growling and won't fetch his ball from the lake. Claire fishes it out for him and sees something in the lake. A woman's face. She can't be clear if that's what she is seeing, but then when she looks again, it is gone. At the same time, Cooper takes off and doesn't return home that night. She tries to call him, but there is no response. Then as she walks into her kitchen, the radio turns on by itself. Claire is so spooked that she turns up to Norman's work, where his colleagues are talking about a new substance they are testing on the lab rats that paralyzes them, but they are still fully aware. Norman comes home with Claire, and he updates her about what he found out about the next-door neighbor's husband. He is harmless and has no records of any kind. She asks about his wife, but he doesn't answer. Claire asks if her name is Mary, which matches the name on the boxes at the front of her house, and Norman says yes. The next day, the door opens by itself again, and Claire shuts it, annoyed. Right as she does, a picture falls off the shelf by itself. Claire goes to clean it up, and it's the framed newspaper clipping of Norman receiving a prestigious award for his research and work in genetics. She hears a car and notices her neighbor leaving their house. Claire chooses again to go over to Mary and try to give her the welcome basket. No one is at the house at all, and she notices the female shoes she saw last time with what looks like a spot of blood on them. She is shocked to see the car is back and she didn't hear it. She quietly tries to leave the basket and walk off, but her male neighbor asks if he can help her. Claire nervously tries to explain she was leaving a welcome basket, and he says thank you, but she can't stay as he has to go. Claire asks twice where Mary is, and he doesn't answer, just saying he is on his way out. Claire walks back home. That night she spies on him with her binoculars and tells Jody all about her suspicions. She loses track of him and hears his front door slam shut and sees footprints near her house. She begins to go into a full panic mode when she jumps so high at the sound of Norman behind her, asking her what she is doing. He is not impressed she is spying on the neighbor. Norman is annoyed and asks why she is not dressed for dinner, and Claire had forgotten all about a dinner they had planned with one of Norman's friends. As they are heading to the restaurant, Norman sarcastically says anything could explain why Merritt there. She could have the flu or be abducted by aliens. Norman brings up to his friends that they are living in his father's old stately home on a lake, and that it is haunted as Claire keeps hearing things. Claire feels put on the spot and didn't want anyone to know, but she explains she hears voices and a picture fell by itself. Norman turns it into a joke that it's his dad, and he doesn't like the renovations they have done. Claire laughs along, but she is hurt by Norman turning it into a joke. That night, Claire replaces the glass on the framed picture that fell earlier and steps on a piece of glass. She pulls it out and notices something shiny in the grate in the floor beneath Norman's desk. She fishes it out with a knife and notices it's a strange-looking key and pockets it in her nightgown. As she is walking up the stairs, she notices steam floating out of the bathroom. To her uneasiness, the bathtub is full of very warm water right up to the brim. She is shaken by this unexplained occurrence and slowly walks over and leans down to pull the plug. After she pulls the plug, she is about to straighten up when she sees a woman in the reflection of the water standing right next to her. She screams wildly in sheer terror. Norman wakes up from her scream and runs to the bathroom. Claire throws her arms around him, and he tells her to calm down and that it's okay. The next day she is visiting a psychologist for a session, and the therapist asked if it was her idea, but it was Norman's. She explains that she hasn't been the same since her daughter moved out. She confesses to him that she saw a ghost in the reflection of the mirror and asks what she should do. To her surprise, he tells her to find out what she wants and to communicate with her. The next night, she invites Jody over to do a seance, and she has Mary's shoe from next door. Claire tries to ask to communicate with the spirit of Mary. Jody tries not to laugh, but does because it's so funny. Jody tries to say her name, and Claire asks again. This time the candle beside them starts to flicker. The planchette flinches, and then the candle goes out by itself. Jody is very spooked. The bathroom door starts to slowly open by itself, and the other door to her bedroom flings open, hitting the bathroom cabinet, revealing her dog Cooper. She yells at Cooper after having such a fright. Claire says goodbye to Jody as they have a little laugh about their seance, but she tells Jody to please not tell Norman about it, that it would only encourage him worrying about her mental health and treating her like she is loopy ever since the car crash. Claire goes back inside to clean up the bathroom they did the seance in and put the Ouija board away, and when she picks up a few items out in the hall and returns, the master bathroom is full of steam again. She walks in to see the bath is filled to the brim again, and instead of leaning down to pull the plug, she whirls around and asks the ghost what it wants. In the bathroom cabinet mirror, the words, "You know," are written. Claire runs out of the bathroom and goes to the phone. When she turns to see something invisible typing the initials MEF repeatedly, she marches into Norman's study, where he is working, and tells him she is a ghost. Norman is oblivious to what she means, and then realizes she means Mary Fewer next door. She said she did a seance with Jody, and when she went back, she was there. Instead of being understanding or concerned, Norman takes Claire's hysteria as punishing him for working so much. Claire gets even more upset at this, and tells him there is something definitely wrong going on in their home and that she feels it's Mary and her husband was the one who did it. Claire takes off right away to confront her neighbor about his missing wife, and Norman tries to stop her and tells her she is overreacting. She marches into the building, walks up and pushes him in the back, and tells him she knows he did it and he won't get away with it. Her neighbor is bewildered and confused and asks her what she is talking about. Claire then loses her temper and calls him a murderer. Her neighbor's wife walks over to see if her husband is okay, and he says to Claire he didn't hurt his wife and asks if she is okay. Claire is shocked she had it all wrong. Claire goes back to the therapist and then starts to say everything that is going on is just because she is going through some kind of midlife crisis. She goes home feeling very embarrassed and deflated until she sees a gift bag on her doorstep. There is a ghost-themed card which reads, from Jody, that she thought she might need what's in the bag. She lifts a book on ghosts out of the bag. As she is looking the book over, Mary from next door calls to her and deeply apologizes for the distress she put Claire through and how she scared her by disappearing like that, and what it must have seemed like. Claire tells Mary it's totally fine, and to forget all about it, and invites Mary over for coffee. Claire asks her what she was so afraid of when she heard her crying in the backyard, and Mary explains that she was just overwhelmed to a point she couldn't breathe around her husband. She left him and went to her mother's house, but he brought her things out in the night and begged for her to come home, and she did. That night, Claire attends a dinner party with Norman for a work event. Claire keeps a low profile, but one of his friends starts to talk to her and asks if she was okay after what happened last time she saw her at Norman's party for the DuPont chair. The lady says she remembers Claire being so white it looked like she had seen a ghost. Then Claire starts to remember how upset she was and apologizes for smashing the lady's glasses. The lady wipes her concerns away for her glasses and says she genuinely hopes she is okay. When Claire gets home, she looks at the framed picture again from the DuPont chair party and looks at her face next to Norman as if to remember what had upset her. She puts it back down on the mantelpiece and turns to walk away when she hears it smash on the ground. This time she picks it up from the back, but the back of the frame comes off completely, and Claire notices the back of the clipping with a small news piece about a missing girl and catches the name of her, Madison Elizabeth, but the rest of her name is cut off. She goes on the internet to find any info on her and to see if she can find her full name. She goes onto the Vermont Missing Persons website and finds the only Madison Elizabeth with the surname of Frank. MEF. She clicks on her name to see a beautiful blonde woman with green eyes that looks similar to Claire. Claire gasps, as it is the same face she saw in the bath. The next morning, Norman kisses her good morning, and then Claire shows him the printout of the missing Madison girl. Norman looks at it and says it is the girl that went missing last year. Claire asks if he knew her, but he says no. Claire explains that this is the girl she saw in the bathtub. Norman becomes angry and tells her to stop, that he has tried to be there for her, but she needs to stop all this. Claire just plainly tells him again that it's her. Claire continues more investigation and rings the sheriff's department. She manages to get some info on the case, and that her mother's house is nearby, and Claire decides to visit her. She pretends she is a friend she met at a party, and her mother talks about her and offers Claire to see her room. Once there, she sees a cutting of her hair from when she was younger, and she steals it without her mother seeing. Claire had been reading that she needs to use something of the person's hair or clothes to try to communicate with. Before Norman comes home, Claire uses Madison's hair to channel her and invite her spirit into her. Norman looks around for Claire and doesn't find her, until she approaches him in the kitchen in a red dress. She speaks in a different manner, very seductive, and calls Norman Professor. She aggressively kisses him, biting him on the lip, rips his shirt open, and straddles him on the office desk. Suddenly, she turns around to look at the front door, and sees Claire standing staring in shock at her. She turns back to Norman, and tells him she thinks that she is onto something. Norman asks who, and she tells him his wife, and at that time Claire's eyes glint green, revealing Madison's eyes for a second. Norman freaks out and pushes Claire off him onto the floor, and tells her to stop it. The sudden throw on the floor returns Claire back to herself, and with that she remembers everything about Norman and Madison's affair. She remembers seeing Madison on top of Norman on his desk as she stood at the front door, and then she got into her car and had the car accident. Norman tries to calm her and apologize. Claire cries out in anguish that she gave up everything for Norman, her life and her music. Norman defensively tells her that she was happy to give it up with a small baby, and then she resented him for it and gave all her love and attention to her daughter Caitlin, not him, so when a young woman took an interest in him, he slipped. Claire will not hear of it and takes off to Jody's house. Jody confesses she knew about Norman's affair, but after her car accident, which it seemed like Claire had done on purpose, and the way Norman was so upset for Claire, she chose not to say anything. Jody pleads for Claire not to hate her. Claire, with tears in her eyes, tells her she doesn't hate her at all. As they sit there, Norman leaves a voicemail asking Jody to tell Claire to come home. Claire asks Jody to tell Norman that she will be back in the morning. She has to ask him something. When she gets home, the house is quiet, but Norman's car is there. She walks up the stairs to find Norman unconscious in the bathtub with a hairdryer in the bath. She rings the ambulance, and Norman is taken to hospital. He recovers enough to come back home. Claire cannot wait any longer, and directly asks him if he had anything to do with her disappearance. To her surprise, Norman says yes, that he had an affair with her, and when he tried to break it off, she came to the house and threatened to for Claire. He didn't take her seriously, and she disappeared. Claire reacts by saying that the ghost in the house is Madison, and she is trying to hurt him or herself, that it was Madison that attacked him and caused the accident with the hairdryer. Norman disagrees, saying that they don't know if she is even deceased, she just went missing. But Claire says it's the only thing that makes sense. And then it dawns on her that perhaps it's her own fault Madison has more power, because she opened the door by using the braid of hers that she stole from her mother's house. Claire says she needs to lie down a while, and wants to be left alone, and Norman nods and accepts that. After a little while, Norman thinks Claire is asleep, and takes a look at the book she is lying next to. He takes it to his study, and then rings someone he knows to ask for a paranormal expert he knows that he would like to talk to. The expert rings him back, and Norman asks him questions, like if Claire could be creating the manifestations herself, but the expert says it happens all the time, that people can get in contact with spirits. As he is talking, he looks out of his office window and sees Claire heading towards the jetty over the lake. He follows her down there and watches as she jumps off the edge and dives down. Norman dives down after her. Claire finds a small chest, but then Norman reaches her and pulls Claire back up to the surface. In the commotion, Claire asks where the braid is that she had in her hand the whole time, but Norman had grabbed it and then handed it back to her. Inside the house, they sit in silence after Norman burns the plate. The next day, Norman comes into the house and finds Claire practicing on her violin, something she hasn't done in many years. She tells him that she feels Madison is gone. He begs for Claire to give him a second chance, and he will make it up to her. He takes her out on his yacht, and Claire suggests they go to a small cafe for lunch. That night, as Claire is soaking in her bath, her bathrobe falls to the floor off the hook by itself. The same bathrobe with the key she found in its pocket. The next day when they go sailing again, they go to the town of Adamant to have lunch, the same place Jody saw Norman with Madison, and right next door is a little gift shop. Claire walks over to the gift shop and looks in the mirror to see the very same chest that she found at the bottom of the lake. She gets out her key, and they match the other keys in the other chests. That night, while Norman is sleeping, she heads out to get the chest and open it with the key to see what's inside. She leaves their room, but Norman stays on his side, but with his eyes open. Claire comes back inside later, completely soaked, and kneels in the main entrance to open the chest. It is what Claire is expecting, but makes it no less horrifying. She sees the same necklace Madison had on in her missing people's photo. In shock, she goes to the kitchen to get her cordless phone and to ring the police. But Norman approaches her, telling her she doesn't know what it is. He tries to explain that Madison took the house, and he hid her body in effects. Claire asks if she thinks she is stupid. He tries to say she made a letter for Claire, but he burnt it. Norman says there was nothing he could do, so he drove her car to the boat ramp and rolled it out onto the lake. He asks Claire what he was supposed to do, sacrifice everything in their marriage. He asks for her to forgive him. Claire responds by saying that the girl must be brought up. Norman calls the police in front of her and asks them to come up and speak to him about Madison, the missing girl. He then tells Claire he is going up for a shower. Claire waits a while, then goes upstairs and checks on the phone's redial. She realizes he didn't call the police at all, and Norman comes up to her from behind and covers her mouth and nose with a cloth. Claire tries to get away, and she starts to lose the ability to move her legs. She drags herself along until she can only look around on her stomach and not move her body at all. He explains how Madison threatened to destroy his marriage and career, then confesses to holding her. He carries Claire upstairs to the master bathroom and puts her in the bath, and proceeds to fill it up. Claire can do nothing but blink and look at what's going on. Norman explains how he will make it look like she did it herself. The bathtub is filling up quickly, and Norman leans over to look at the necklace Claire has on, which is Madison's. He lifts Claire's neck up to see the necklace, and when he lets her head back down, her face flashes to that of Madison's face. Norman gets such a shock that he jumps back, hitting his head on the wall, and then falls down, hitting the side of his head on the bathroom sink, then falls to the ground. Claire looks, but he does not get up. Suddenly, she sees Norman's bloodied hand grip the side of the bath, and he lifts his head up to look at her and reaches his arms for her, but he succumbs to his injury again and falls unconscious. Claire now focuses on trying to stop the bath filling with water, otherwise she will drown. Getting a tiny bit of feeling back in her toes, she uses her big toe to hook around the bath plug. She manages to lift the plug up, but not enough to lift it completely, and it gets stuck halfway unplugged. It is not enough to combat the running water, which is now covering her mouth and nose. She uses her left hand to move the handheld shower head so that the cord pulls on the hot water tap, enough to turn it right down, and the water is not covering her whole face. The water drainage is not fast enough, and with sheer luck she strikes the plug and causes it to completely dislodge, and the water begins to drain faster, and Claire holds her breath while it comes back past her nose and mouth, taking huge gasps. By now, feeling is coming back into her body, and she manages with great difficulty to lift herself out of the bath. She sees that Norman is no longer there at all in the bathroom, and she is on edge and wary. She grabs a shard of glass from the broken vanity mirror that Norman smashed when he fell, and walks downstairs very slowly. She sees Norman lying at the base of the stairs, bleeding from his head, not moving. Claire wants the phone to call the police, so she walks warily over to him and tries to pull the phone from his pocket. His fingers flicker, giving Claire a jump scare, and she decides instead to just take off in a car to get away and has the mobile phone with her. She grabs the keys and tries her car, but realizes she grabbed the keys to the F-100 with the boat attached to the back instead. As she is getting in the car, Norman is waking up and heading out the door towards her. She puts the car in gear and takes off. As she is driving, heading over the bridge, she is waiting to get cell phone reception at the halfway mark of the bridge. She gets reception and begins to call 911. However, Norman has caught a ride in the boat and climbed his way into the car. He grabs at her while she is driving, causing her to crash into the lake. The car is filling with water, and she can't unwind the window any further. Norman is in the back seat, and his jeans are caught on something so he can't get out either. As the water rushes in, he holds her so she can't escape. The car becomes completely submerged, and they both hold their breath. Claire tries to struggle away from him, when suddenly the ghost of Madison, who Norman had dumped in the lake last year, floats up from the bottom of the lake and heads towards Norman. Norman is so shocked he lets go of Claire, and she kicks at Norman and breaks free out of the car. Later, Claire visits Madison's grave and leaves a single beautiful red rose on her tombstone.